Harold here, and welcome to the channel. Here are the kind of questions I get. Hey Richard, how can I build a mild 400 horsepower big block Chevy combination? How can I build a 500 horsepower version, or a 600 horsepower version, or a 700 horsepower version? You get the idea. So I'm going to do a dedicated series on how to build a given power output for big block Chevys, starting with 400 horsepower. I'm going to provide 3 very easy dyno-proven combinations that exceed 400 horsepower. In the next video, we're going to do 5, and then 6, and then 7. You get it all the way up to 1,000 horsepower. So let's check out our 400 horsepower big block Chevy combos. In this video, I'm going to show you 3 different dyno-proven combinations that exceeded 400 horsepower from a big block Chevy. I'm going to show you a Gen 5 version, a Gen 6 version, and the late model Gen 7 version, and rest assured all of this stuff carries over to the previous original Mark IV big block. Let's jump right in and get things started with our 400 horsepower big block combinations, and we started off in this particular instance with a Gen 5 454, meaning that it was equipped with a number of undesirable features, including this particular one was a 92. It had factory throttle body fuel injection, very limiting in power for the big block. It had a hydraulic flat tappet camshaft, not the hydraulic roller stuff used in the later Gen 6. It also had peanut port heads, which all of these things can kind of conspire to keep the power output. In fact, it was factory rated at between 230 and 245 horsepower, so fairly low. Now, there's a big difference between the factory rating and the way that we run it on the engine dyno. First of all, we eliminated the throttle body injection right away and ran a dual plane and a carburetor. But even if we were to run the TBI on here on the engine dyno, which we could, there's a difference between the rated power output and the numbers that we get on the engine dyno. First of all, the rated power output is really the way that the motor is in the vehicle. Now, the rating isn't done at the wheels, it's actually done at the flywheel, but they have everything in the motor when they test this thing and rate it for power. So they have the full exhaust, stock exhaust manifolds, cats, exhaust all the way back. They have all the accessories, the fan, water pump, all that stuff. They have the factory tune, which is very conservative. They run it at temperature. They have the factory air induction system. All of those things are on there so that the person gets that power output when they run it in the vehicle. The way that we run it on the engine dyno, no accessories, electric water pump. We ran this thing with long tube headers. We run it colder than they do when they rate it at the factory. We ran, in this case on our motor, we got a motor from the wrecking yard, which is an unknown condition. Basically, we know that it ran. We replaced the throttle body injection with a dual plane intake manifold and a carburetor and a different distributor to get rid of the computer controlled distributor, and ran it on the engine dyno that way. I mean, it still had the factory peanut port heads, the factory camshaft, and the bottom end was all stock too. But it's a different starting point, and obviously we ran a carbureted induction system with right off the bat, compared to a throttle body injection, is a big step up in performance, because the throttle body, along with the other things that I mentioned, the peanut port heads and the mild cam timing and very, very low compression, less than 8-to-1, are all things that limit the real power production of this kind of junkyard motor. But run in this condition, our 1992 Gen 5 454, low compression, peanut port head, stock camshaft, but with a dual plane. And I think that this thing was a Wyand. Yes, there's an 8019 Wyand dual plane, a Holley 750. We ran our 2¼ inch dyno headers on this thing. And run in this configuration, our otherwise stock Gen 5 454 produced 334 horsepower and 448 foot-pounds of torque. Here's what happened. Here's how we got this combination to exceed 400 horsepower. There are a number of ways to do it, but here's one that we did. What we did was we maintained the peanut port heads. They were surfaced. They were given a good valve job. They put springs in it because we were running a different camshaft. The other thing that we did was, one of the things that really helped this combination is we got rid of the factory piston and installed a set of forged dome pistons. So these things had a 22 or 23 cc dome on them, which brought the compression up dramatically. And I'll go ahead and put up the change in compression up here. But the compression is nice because it adds power basically everywhere. It makes the motor a lot more responsive. We also made the motor a little bit bigger because when we added these pistons, we bored this thing out 30 thousandths and put a 30 over set of pistons in. Retained the peanut port heads, but did step up in camshaft. We replaced the factory cam with an Extreme Energy 268, and it's still a hydraulic flat tappet cam. I'll go ahead and put the specs up here so you guys can take a look at that. We ran a dual plane intake manifold, not the YN. We actually ran a Speedmaster version, ran a 750 carburetor, and then obviously the distributor, we optimized the air, fuel, and timing. And run in that manner, we were able to improve the power output to 451 horsepower and 549 foot-pounds of torque. And as you can see, the combination gained power everywhere over the stock one, because when you're starting out with a low compression, mild cam, peanut port headed kind of big block, there's really nowhere to go but up. So let's take a look at our next combo that made over 400. There are obviously a number of different ways to exceed 400 horsepower with a big block Chevy. We showed you already. Grab a Gen 5 motor and the upgrades that we applied to that to get or actually exceed 400 horsepower. But there are much easier ways to do that. In fact, if you go to the wrecking yard and you're getting a big block, you would be much better off and your life would be much easier to exceed 400 horsepower if you just grab a Gen 6 motor instead of the Gen 5. Now, both of them obviously are a good starting point and you can make lots of power with either one of them. But if you grab a Gen 6, the only thing that you need to do basically is add a cam and springs to that Gen 6, and then you'll already exceed the 400 horsepower level. And the reason for that is the Gen 6 motor has a lot of things going for it that the Gen 5 motor does not. First of all, it has better cylinder heads. It has a set of standard oval port heads, which have small chambers on them. They're going to be more desirable than the peanut port head. It also has a factory hydraulic roller camshaft, which all by itself, if the specs are not there, you'll get a little bit of a gain, obviously, from it being a hydraulic roller and not a flat tap. And I think that they're probably ultimately going to last longer. But the slightly higher compression, the rated power output is already higher on the Gen 6. It's about 50 horsepower better than the Gen 5, so it already makes more power right from the factory. It's got a better cylinder head, got a better potential camshaft. And so what you can do is if you just take that combination and put it on the engine dyno the way that we did the Gen 5, add a dual plane intake manifold and a carburetor like we did on the Gen 5, and now all you have to do is put a camshaft in it, cam and valve springs to go with the camshaft, and you can easily exceed 400 horsepower the way that we tested on the dyno. So here's a perfect example. This was a Gen 6 454. This was a 95. We also ran this with the factory fuel injection. It makes a little bit less peak power and a little bit more torque down low with the long runner stuff. So if you want to maintain the factory fuel injection, the Gen 6 is still a better choice because it has individual port injection with a much more desirable intake manifold configuration than the throttle body injected Gen 5. We ran this with a carburetor. We ran it with an Edelbrock RPM air gap intake manifold, the dual plane, which is the choice for this because it's fairly low RPM. We ran a 650 Holly, which is more than enough to feed our 370 horsepower motor. We ran it with our long tube headers and a distributor in this thing. Run in this manner, our Gen 6 motor produced 370 horsepower. And that's kind of where they are. They all seem to fall into the 365 to 375 horsepower range, depending on what kind of condition that they're in. And this thing made 476 foot-pounds of torque. But here's what happened after we installed an Extreme Energy 276 big block Chevy Gen 6 camshaft in this thing, and a valve spring upgrade on the otherwise stock Gen 6 oval port, standard oval port big block Chevy heads. So you can see right off the bat, not only did we pick up more power, we picked up a lot more torque as well, which is good. So the power went up to 428 horsepower. Peak torque was up to 515 foot-pounds. You can see we loaded this thing down as low as 2,600 or so, and it was still making as much or more power and torque than the mild stock camshaft was with our simple cam upgrade. And you could put an even bigger camshaft in this if you wanted more. Obviously, you could port the stock heads, and that works as well too. But here's a very simple upgrade for a Gen 6 454, just a cam only kind of thing with a carburetor, and you're exceeding 400 horsepower. Of course, I wanted to show you one other possibility. If you're going to the wrecking yard and going to grab a big block from the wrecking yard, you can also choose another option, and that's something that we did recently. All you have to do if you go to the wrecking yard and grab a big block, if you can just find one of the Gen 7 big block version, which is an 8.1 liter or a 496, if you pick the Gen 7 and you can run we actually ran this with the factory fuel injection on it, but you can see in red here, you can easily exceed 400 horsepower without making any changes to it. All we did was basically run it on the dyno the way that we ran the Gen 6 stuff. It already exceeded 400 horsepower, making 423 horsepower. All we did was put long tube headers on it. And the thing made a ton of torque, 554 foot-pounds of torque. So if you choose wisely, you don't even have to make any changes to the motor if you can find one of the 8.1s. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay, guys, what did we learn from this little adventure? Exceeding 400 horsepower with a 454 cubic inch motor, whether it's a Gen 5, Gen 6, or Gen 7. We learned that's actually fairly easy. Now, we spent a lot of time building a dedicated short block for the Gen 5 motor. We didn't actually have to do that. In fact, I did that so later on I could use that short block for a lot of other testing. We ran a number of different cylinder heads, different camshafts, intake manifolds, nitrous, you name it. But even equipped with those basically stock peanut port heads, thing easily exceeded 400 horsepower with the right camshaft. With the Gen 6 motor, it was even easier. All we had to do was put basically a camshaft in the stock Junkyard motor and springs, voila, over 400 horsepower. And with the Gen 7 motor, even easier. All we had to do was put that thing up on the dyno, and having 8.1 liters of displacement easily allowed that combination to exceed 400 horsepower. So here's the question. Will 500 be even more difficult? Well, let's find out. We're going to go to 500, then 600, and then 700, etc., etc., etc. I'm Richard Holder. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. More big block testing coming up.